When Daniel proposed to me on that quiet Sunday evening in Riverside Park, everything felt perfect. We'd been walking the same path for months, but that day felt different. The sunset painted everything golden, and I couldn't stop staring at the ring he nervously slipped onto my finger. It wasn't just about the proposal. It was about the certainty in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, and the way he whispered my name like it meant everything to him. We sat on our favorite bench afterward, just watching the ducks swim across the pond. Daniel kept asking if I was happy, if the ring fit right, if I liked the way he'd done it. I laughed and told him he was being silly. Of course I was happy. I'd been waiting for this moment for 2 years, and it was even better than I'd imagined. That night, I couldn't wait to share the news with my family. Mom cried when I called, and Dad actually got emotional, which never happens. My younger brother Jake made jokes about finally getting rid of me, but I could hear the excitement in his voice. Everyone seemed genuinely thrilled for us. But something shifted the moment my half-sister Clarissa heard the news. She'd been staying with us for a few weeks after her latest breakup, and when I showed her the ring, she clapped and hugged me like she was supposed to. Her reaction seemed right on the surface, but something felt off. Her eyes kept drifting to Daniel with a flicker of something I couldn't quite name at the time. Daniel was making coffee in the kitchen when she walked over to him. I watched from the living room as she congratulated him, her hand resting on his arm a little too long. She laughed at something he said, but it was too loud, too forced. When she looked at him, there was this intensity that made me uncomfortable. It felt like admiration, but not the harmless kind you'd expect from a future sister-in-law. I told myself I was overthinking things. Clarissa had always been a little dramatic, always craving attention. She'd been the center of our family's focus for years because of her various crises and heartbreaks. Maybe she was just adjusting to not being the main character in everyone's story for once. But that evening during dinner, I caught her watching him again. Her smile was a little too wide, her gaze lingering a little too long when he talked about our wedding plans. Daniel, as always, stayed by my side, completely unaware of her subtle signals. He kept his arm around my chair and looked at me when he spoke about our future together. Still, something about the way she twirled her hair and laughed too loudly at his jokes left me uneasy. She'd never been particularly interested in any of my previous boyfriends. She'd barely acknowledged them, actually. But with Daniel, she seemed to come alive in a way that made my stomach twist. I tried to push the feeling away. Families blend awkwardly sometimes, especially when there's a big change like an engagement. Clarissa had been dealing with her own relationship problems, so maybe she was just happy to be around a stable couple for once. Maybe she was even a little envious of what Daniel and I had together. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was starting. Something I didn't want to name or acknowledge. Deep down, I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a problem I wasn't ready to face. The weeks that followed were completely crazy with wedding planning. Between cake tastings, dress fittings, and endless arguments about the guest list, I barely had time to breathe. Daniel remained calm and steady through it all, which was exactly what I needed. While I stressed about flowers and seating charts, he'd rub my shoulders and remind me that the only thing that really mattered was us saying "I do." Clarissa became unusually involved in everything. She volunteered to help with nearly every task, from addressing invitations to researching caterers. At first, I actually appreciated her enthusiasm. She seemed eager to support me, and I wanted to believe that maybe this was her way of bonding with me for once. We'd never been particularly close growing up, but I hoped the wedding might bring us together. However, the way she inserted herself into our moments made me increasingly uncomfortable. She'd sit too close when Daniel and I discussed wedding plans, offering opinions on everything from the color scheme to the music. She even suggested coming along when we went to look at venues, saying she had a good eye for these things. What really bothered me was how she started acting around Daniel specifically. She'd offer to run errands with him when I was busy with work. She suggested he try on suits while she gave a second opinion, even though we'd already planned to do that together. When he'd come home from work, she'd be waiting with a beer and questions about his day, like she was playing house. I noticed how she started dressing differently when he was around too. More polished, more revealing. She'd never cared much about her appearance before, usually just throwing on whatever was clean. But suddenly, she was wearing makeup to breakfast and picking out outfits that showed off her figure. The change was subtle, but I saw it. She had never tried to impress anyone in my life before, least of all a man I was with. Every time I looked at Daniel, though, he was exactly the same. Kind, thoughtful, and entirely focused on me. He'd ask for my opinion on everything, from what tie to wear to work, to what movie we should watch. When Clarissa would try to join our conversations, he'd include her politely, but always turn back to me. He never seemed to notice her new clothes, or her attempts to get his attention. I tried to convince myself that if he hadn't noticed her behavior, there was no real threat. Daniel wasn't the type to encourage attention from other women. He'd never given me any reason to doubt his loyalty or his love, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Clarissa's admiration wasn't innocent anymore. The worst part was feeling like I was watching her play a game I hadn't agreed to join. She'd touch his arm when she talked to him, laugh a little too hard at his jokes, and find excuses to be in the same room whenever he was around. It was like she was testing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. How she'd position herself so Daniel would have to look at her when he talked. How she'd bring up topics she knew would interest him. How she'd volunteer to help with anything that might give her time alone with him. It was calculated in a way that made me feel sick. But maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was so stressed about the wedding that I was seeing problems where none existed. Maybe Clarissa was just being friendly, and I was reading too much into normal family interactions. I wanted to believe that, but every day seemed to bring new evidence that my gut feeling was right. My birthday arrived in late September, and Daniel threw a surprise dinner at our favorite restaurant downtown. He'd invited close friends and family, and for a while, I forgot about everything else. The place was decorated with photos of us from the past 3 years, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to celebrate with us. It was one of those perfect nights where everything felt right with the world. Clarissa showed up wearing a tight red dress I'd never seen before, her hair in soft waves, and heels higher than I'd ever seen her wear. She looked stunning, and she knew it. Her eyes sparkled as she greeted Daniel with a hug that lingered just a moment too long. I watched him pat her back awkwardly and step away, but she didn't seem to notice his discomfort. Throughout the evening, I watched her move around him like a magnet. She'd offer to get him drinks from the bar, ask for his help reaching something, or brush his arm lightly while making a point in conversation. She laughed loudly at everything he said, even when no one else did. When he told a story about work that wasn't particularly funny, she practically doubled over with laughter while everyone else just smiled politely. I could feel her trying to pull him into her orbit, but Daniel never strayed from mine. He always looked for me in a room, reached for my hand under the table, and gave me that smile that reminded me I was the only one he saw. When people toasted to our future marriage, he squeezed my hand and looked directly at me, not at anyone else. But I couldn't enjoy my night fully. Her presence became a shadow over everything, a constant reminder that not all was right. I found myself watching her instead of listening to my friend's stories. I noticed how she'd position herself in his line of sight, how she'd lean in close when he talked, how she'd find excuses to touch his hand or his shoulder. My friend Sarah pulled me aside at one point and asked if I was okay. I must have looked as tense as I felt. I told her I was fine, just tired from wedding planning, but she didn't look convinced. She glanced over at Clarissa, who was currently showing Daniel something on her phone, standing close enough that their shoulders were touching. "Is everything all right with your sister?" Sarah asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer that question. What was I supposed to say? That I thought my half-sister was trying to seduce my fiancé? That I was watching her flirt with him at my own birthday party? It sounded crazy even in my own head. When we got home that night, I sat in our bedroom in silence, still wearing my party dress. Daniel came in and asked what was wrong, and I almost told him everything right then. But what if I was wrong? What if I was being paranoid and jealous over nothing? What if bringing it up would make things worse? Instead, I told him I was just overwhelmed with wedding planning and tired from the party. He sat beside me on the bed and pulled me close, telling me how much he loved me and how proud he was to be marrying me. He talked about our future together, about the house we'd buy and the life we'd build. His words should have comforted me, but I kept thinking about Clarissa's red dress and the way she'd looked at him all night. After everyone left the restaurant, I had stayed behind to thank the staff while Daniel and Clarissa walked to the car together. When I caught up with them, they were standing close together, and she was laughing at something he'd said. The laugh was different from her usual one. Softer, more intimate. When she noticed me approaching, her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she looked straight at me without guilt, almost defiantly. That look haunted me as I tried to fall asleep that night. It wasn't the face of someone who was innocent. It was the face of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and didn't care who got hurt in the process. A few days after the party, I came home from work early to find Clarissa and Daniel in the living room together. They weren't doing anything obviously wrong, just sitting on the couch talking. But something about the scene made my stomach drop. She was sitting closer to him than necessary, her body turned toward his, and she was touching his arm while she laughed at something he'd said. What struck me most was how she looked at him. It was different now, bolder than before. Her eyes never left his face, and there was an intensity there that made my skin crawl. This wasn't sisterly affection or innocent friendship. This was something else entirely, something that had no place in my home. When she noticed me in the doorway, her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she looked straight at me without guilt, almost defiantly. She didn't pull her hand away from his arm or move to put distance between them. If anything, she seemed to lean in closer, like she was claiming territory. Daniel, on the other hand, immediately stood up when he saw me. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even relieved that I was home. He came over and kissed me, but I could feel the tension in his body. Something had been happening before I arrived, and I needed to know what it was. "How was work?" he asked, but his voice sounded strained. Clarissa remained on the couch, watching us with a strange smile on her face. She didn't even pretend to look embarrassed about whatever I'd walked in on. I made small talk for a few minutes, but I felt like I was going to explode. The air in the room felt thick and wrong, like something had been disturbed and couldn't be put back in place. Clarissa eventually went upstairs, but not before giving Daniel another long look that made my blood boil. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. After dinner, I asked Daniel to come upstairs with me, and once we were alone in our bedroom, I completely broke down. I told him everything I had seen and felt over the past few weeks. All the moments that had been bothering me, all the little things that had seemed wrong, all the ways Clarissa had been crossing boundaries. I cried as I talked, the words pouring out of me like I'd been holding them back for months. I told him about the way she looked at him, the way she touched him, the way she dressed when he was around. I told him about the birthday party and how she'd been inserting herself into our relationship. I told him how scared I was that she was going to ruin everything we'd built together. Daniel listened quietly, holding my hands while I fell apart. He didn't interrupt or try to defend her or tell me I was being crazy. He just let me say everything I needed to say, and when I finally finished, he pulled me into his arms and held me tight. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into my hair. "I should have said something sooner. I should have protected you from this." He told me that from the moment he met me, I had been the only one in his heart. He said Clarissa's behavior had made him uncomfortable too, but he didn't know how to bring it up without making things worse. He'd been trying to be polite and avoid conflict, but he realized now that his silence had been hurting me. "She's been trying to get me alone," he admitted. "She asks me about our relationship, about whether I'm really happy, about whether I'm sure I want to get married. She's been testing me, and I've been trying to ignore it, but it's getting worse." Hearing him say it out loud made everything real in a way that terrified me. This wasn't just my imagination or my insecurity. This was actually happening. My own sister was actively trying to sabotage my relationship, and she'd been doing it right under my nose. Daniel promised to set boundaries and protect our relationship. He said he'd talk to Clarissa the next day and make it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. In that moment, feeling his arms around me and hearing his voice so full of love and determination, my fears melted into something stronger: trust. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. Daniel had promised to talk to Clarissa, but I didn't know what to expect. Part of me hoped she would apologize and back off, but another part of me knew it wouldn't be that simple. She'd been too bold, too confident in her behavior to give up easily. I left for work early, partly because I had meetings, and partly because I couldn't bear to be in the house during their conversation. All day, I checked my phone constantly, waiting for updates from Daniel. He texted me around noon to say it was done, but he didn't give me any details. I'd have to wait until I got home to find out what had happened. When I walked through the front door that evening, the house felt different, quieter, but also tense, like the air after a thunderstorm. Daniel was in the kitchen making dinner, and he gave me a long hug when he saw me. I could feel the stress in his shoulders, and I knew the conversation hadn't gone well. "How did it go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "She didn't take it well," he said, stirring the pasta sauce more aggressively than necessary. "She got defensive at first, said I was misreading her intentions. But when I told her specifically what behaviors needed to stop, she got angry. Really angry. He told me that Clarissa had accused him of being full of himself, of thinking every woman wanted him. She'd said I was being paranoid and insecure, that she was just being friendly. But when Daniel remained firm about the boundaries, she'd finally dropped the act. She said something that really bothered me," Daniel continued. "She said she didn't think you and I were that serious, that she thought you were just settling for me. She said she could offer me something better." My heart sank. Hearing those words, even secondhand, felt like a punch to the gut. Not because I believed them, but because they revealed just how little respect Clarissa had for me and our relationship. She wasn't just attracted to Daniel. She actively wanted to hurt me. I found her in the living room later that evening, sitting on the couch with her arms crossed. She looked up at me when I walked in, and there was no shame in her eyes, no apology, just defiance and anger. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down across from her. "I guess we do," she replied, her voice cold. I told her plainly that she had crossed a line, that her behavior toward my fiancé was unacceptable and disrespectful. I said I understood she might be going through a difficult time, but that didn't give her the right to interfere in my relationship. She didn't deny it. Instead, she shrugged and said, "I didn't think you two were that serious. You've only been together a few years." "We're engaged," I said, my voice rising. "We're planning our wedding. How is that not serious?" "People get engaged all the time," she said dismissively. "It doesn't mean anything until you actually go through with it." I realized then that she genuinely didn't understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, Daniel was fair game until the moment we said "I do." She couldn't comprehend that some boundaries should never be crossed, that some relationships should be respected regardless of their legal status. I told her that if she continued to disrespect my relationship, she would no longer be welcome in my life. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to say. Clarissa was my sister, and despite everything, I loved her. But she had chosen to ignore the bond we shared in pursuit of something that was never hers to take. "Fine," she said, standing up. "Maybe it's better this way. Maybe you'll see what you're really getting into with him." The words stung, but I held my ground. I had to choose between protecting my relationship and keeping peace with my sister. The choice was clear, even if it wasn't easy. Clarissa moved out 3 days later. She didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just packed her things while Daniel and I were at work and left her key on the kitchen counter. I found myself both relieved and heartbroken. The house felt peaceful again, but there was also an emptiness where she used to be. My mother called that weekend, upset about the situation. Clarissa had told her some version of the story, painting herself as the victim and me as the paranoid, controlling sister who'd driven her away. Mom tried to smooth things over, suggesting family dinners and heart-to-heart conversations, but I held firm. Some relationships can't be repaired until both sides are willing to acknowledge the damage that was done. "She's your sister," Mom kept saying, as if that simple fact erased everything that had happened. Family is forever. But I'd learned that being family doesn't give someone the right to hurt you. It doesn't mean you have to accept disrespect or betrayal just because you share DNA. Sometimes protecting yourself means stepping away from people you love, even when it breaks your heart. In the months that followed, wedding preparations resumed with renewed joy. Without Clarissa's presence casting a shadow over everything, Daniel and I found our rhythm again. We laughed more, stressed less, and focused on what really mattered, building a life together based on trust and respect. Daniel remained steady and supportive throughout everything, but I could see he was more in tune with me than ever before. He'd check in more often, ask how I was feeling, make sure I knew how much he loved me. The crisis had brought us closer together in ways I hadn't expected. He helped me work through my feelings about Clarissa. never judging me for being hurt or angry. When I felt guilty about cutting her out of my life, he reminded me that I'd tried to set boundaries, and she'd chosen to ignore them. When I worried about what other people thought, he told me that the only opinions that mattered were ours. "You're not responsible for her choices," he'd say when I got upset about the whole situation. "You're only responsible for protecting yourself and our relationship." Every time he looked at me, I could see it clearly. I was his choice, every single day. Not because he had to choose me, but because he wanted to. The way he loved me wasn't desperate or possessive. It was steady and secure, the kind of love that builds a foundation for a lifetime. My friends were incredibly supportive too. Sarah had suspected something was wrong at my birthday party, and when I finally told her the whole story, she wasn't surprised. She said she'd watched Clarissa's behavior that night and felt uncomfortable for me. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she said over coffee one afternoon. "It takes courage to draw those kinds of lines, especially with family." As our wedding day approached, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in months. The guest list was smaller without Clarissa and a few relatives who'd taken her side, but everyone who would be there truly supported our relationship. The people who mattered most understood that love requires protection sometimes. When I walked down the aisle on our wedding day, I didn't think about the chaos or the betrayal. I thought about the man waiting for me at the altar and the strength we'd built together through one of the most difficult periods of our relationship. Daniel's eyes were bright with tears as I approached, and his smile told me everything I needed to know. Clarissa wasn't there, but I didn't miss her. The truth was, I had everything I needed in the person who had only ever had eyes for me. Our love had been tested and had emerged stronger, and that was worth more than any family connection that came with conditions.